Hello, fellow booktubers and fellow readers. What I'd like to share with everyone today is my TBR. I'm going to title this, though, my TBR more or less. I notice a lot of booktubers will put up their TBR for the coming month. So the TBR for September, TBR for October, or TBR for the spring, or something like that. And I really admire that kind of optimism and that kind of, it implies a certain kind of discipline. But I would guess that a lot of those readers often experience what I experience. You start out with the best of intentions, like here are the books I plan on reading over the next 4 weeks. And then somewhere within that 4 weeks, another book will appear on the horizon or attract your attention, and you get distracted and you end up reading other things. I know for myself, I usually start every year with a TBR for the year. I kind of sketch out where I want to go, and sometimes there's a bit of a theme in what I'll be reading, but usually within a pretty short amount of time, sometimes within the first few weeks of the new year, my TBR list begins to mutate and change in a lot of ways. Because I think what happens is, you're going to read, I want to read these particular books within this amount of time, but one of those books will remind you of something else or suggest something else. And if you read nonfiction, biographies and histories, philosophies, things like that, which I do read, you'll notice in the in the footnotes, the author will mention other works by other authors, and you'll think, that sounds kind of interesting, and so you'll go for that, and then suddenly the books that were on your original TBR start to get pushed down a little bit in favor of newer books. Or sometimes there'll be a book recommendation in another book, and you'll realize, I bought that book a couple of years ago, and I never quite read it. So you go rifling through your TBR file, or pile. My TBR pile covers my coffee table and a couple of bookshelves in my various bookcases. And you'll find, there's that book. I want to read it now. So what I want to share with you is my TBR, more or less, over the next month or two, with the understanding that it's certainly going to change. And I'm not casting aspersions on those of you who put up a TBR and stick to it. I admire your optimism and your discipline. I don't share that kind of optimism. I've been a reader for a long time, and I know I can rarely fulfill my TBR as it is originally drafted out. But I do have the enthusiasm for reading. Obviously, that's why I'm on BookTube. And the discipline, not so much. I read. Although my reading there is a method to the madness. Sometimes I'll find a new author or an author I wasn't familiar with, and I want to go out and read everything that author wrote. Or sometimes, at the beginning of this year, I read Homer's Iliad, and then I read some other books about Homer, particularly Robin Lane Fox's recent book called Homer and His Iliad. So I was kind of stuck in that little area before I began to branch off into other things. So as an example of why my TBR looks like the way it does at this very moment, I just want to point out, I've been reading this. This is Harold Bloom's book. I believe it was his last book. Okay, and it's wonderful. It is called Take Arms Against a Sea of Troubles, which is, of course, a quote from Hamlet. And then the subtitle is The Power of the Reader's Mind Over a Universe of Death. It sounds pretty grim, but what Bloom is talking about here is how literature, especially poetry, transcends the time it is written. It transcends the life of the poet. It even transcends the life of the reader or the admirer. And Bloom is the man for this. If you're not familiar with Harold Bloom, as I think I just said, he died a few years ago, but he was once one of America's greatest literary critics. Very controversial figure sometimes. People either loved him or they hated him. I don't know if many people were kind of ambivalent about Bloom. He was on the Charlie Rose show an awful lot. He claimed that he remembered everything he ever read. And I guess that's possible. There's a name for that, but I can't remember what it is. It's not having a photographic memory, but there are people who just can call to mind anything they've ever read. And Bloom claimed to be one of those people, and I have no reason to doubt this. And of course, he was the great Shakespearean scholar of the U.S., but I've always found him interesting. Some people find his books rather challenging. He does have a tendency to ramble a little bit in some of his books, like this was his last book, and he's kind of like doing a bit of a mental clearinghouse of everything he ever thought about certain poets that he really liked and admired. And so it does ramble. He kind of loses his focus here and there. But I always find him entertaining and fascinating. At any rate, this book is about poetry. And this is why my TBR at the moment includes some poetry. I've always liked reading poetry, and I thought maybe, kind of beef up the poetry wing of my library. So with that in mind, I picked up this wonderful edition by the New York Review of Books. This is Walt Whitman's Drum Taps from the 1865 edition. Whitman is probably the great American voice in poetry anyway. He really does, even though he wrote over 150 years ago, he captures the American spirit. Prior to Whitman, America didn't really have a poet. This is a uniquely American voice and one of the giants of all time. And then, speaking of a uniquely American voice, here's Wendel Barry. Okay, the poet. This is the piece of Wild Things. I've read a lot of Barry's essays and some of his poetry. I've always admired him. I don't know how I missed this one, but this is regarded as his greatest collection of poetry, so I'm looking forward to that. And then I picked up this little gem. This is a little larger than the entire universe, selected poems by Fernando Pessoa. Now, this particular author, he was from Portugal. He died in the 1930s. He's regarded as one of the heroes of Portuguese literature. And for some reason, he hasn't been widely translated into English until fairly recently. And my first exposure to Pessoa was this, the Book of Disquiet. This was published just a few years ago. It was unlike anything I'd ever read before. This is a novel without a plot. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but it's endlessly fascinating. What Pessoa had done during his literary life is he had created these characters and he breathed full life into them. Experiences, and even writing astrological charts for some of them. I don't want you to think Pessoa is one of these new agey type guys, but my point is he would imagine full lives for these characters, and then he would write as those characters, which sounds like what most fiction writers do, but he just takes it to a different level. So this really fascinated me. And then when I discovered that Penguin came out with this book, this just came out last year, although it is a revision of an earlier translation of Pessoa. This book the earlier translation of this, I think, came out in 2008. So this one just came out last year, and I'm really looking forward to this. This should be very, very interesting. Then when we get to fiction, I'll be reading a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, Robert Penn Warren's very, very famous and classic, All the King's Men. I'm pretty sure I've read this probably a long time ago when I was in high school. I kind of remember parts of it. I think I was a little too young to appreciate it. But we live in such a politicized time, particularly this year. Politics is just keeping people up at night and tearing families apart and everything else. And this is a real brilliant, entertaining analysis of the American political scene. Although it was written over 100 years ago, a lot of the themes and ideas and characters in this are just as relevant today, maybe even more so. So again, I'll be looking forward to this. Actually not 100 years. Winner of the 1947 Pulitzer Prize, so it's been less than 100 years ago. But again, quite a while ago. And then Wandering Stars. Okay, this is by Tommy Orange. Tommy Orange's first novel was published just a few years ago. It was called There, There. And I'd heard a great deal about it, and I read it, and I was blown away by it. Tommy Orange is a Native American, and his first novel, There, There, was written about the Native American experience as it is today. It's tragic, it was heartbreaking. He's talking about a Native American family trying to maintain their traditions and identity in modern-day Los Angeles. There is some humor in it, a very keen observation, though, of a marginalized people, and I was just so fascinated by it. So this is Orange's second novel. I understand it's something of a sequel to the first novel, or maybe I had read something about it. It was kind of a prequel and a sequel. So some of the characters in his first novel, this talks about their life before the events of the first novel, and then there's some, and parts of this deal with their lives after the events of the first novel. Hope I haven't confused you with that, but no matter what's there, Orange's writing style is clean, and he's a very wise young man. He's a Native American himself, and so I think this should be really intriguing. It's gotten some remarkable reviews. And here's another book that's being talked about a lot, James by Percival Everett. The James of the title is the slave James from Huckleberry Finn, from Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. But this novel is told from James's point of view, and it also talks about the events that happened to him after he parted ways with Huckleberry Finn. And my understanding is a rather droll novel, and part of the conceit of the story is that James put on the mask of kind of ignorant, poorly educated, comic relief, because he could not reveal his true intelligence, because if he did, he would have been beaten, possibly executed during the age of slavery. And so he kind of maintains this false front that he's an idiot. But in reality, he wasn't. He knew exactly what was going on around him. And I think probably that's why the book is called James rather than the more familiar Jim. But again, great reviews. I think I first heard about this from Obama's reading list from last year when this came out. And by the way, Obama puts out a reading list, I think once a year for sure, maybe twice a year. He's got magnificent taste in literature. I always look forward to that. Not everything that he lists is for me, but I've often found some magnificent books from him. I recommend him as a great guide to some modern literature. So there's James. And then, Thucydides and the Idea of History. This is a more recent publication by Neville Morley, who teaches at the University of Bristol. Thucydides was a contemporary or near contemporary of Herodotus. Herodotus is regarded as the father of history. Thucydides, though, is the better historian. Maybe not as entertaining. Herodotus is the father of history, sometimes called the father of lies. I think that's a little harsh. Herodotus liked to repeat what we would think of as urban legends, tall tales, but he is a wonderful source of information for the Greco-Persian War. He's a great read and wonderfully entertaining. But Thucydides, on the other hand, he's entertaining too, and a magnificent source of information for the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides took part in that war. But Thucydides doesn't mess around. He just lays out the facts. Thucydides, they used to call him the first scientific historian, and I don't hear that used too much anymore because I think it confused people. What they meant by that was that Thucydides, when he would describe events, he never relied on supernatural intervention. So if the Athenians lost the war, it wasn't because the gods were angry. They lost the war because this general made a bad move, or the Spartans were better prepared. If there was an earthquake during a battle or an eclipse of the sun, Thucydides just mentions that as a factual event that occurred. He never ties it to any supernatural agency. At any rate, and I'm also teaching a section of ancient Greek history during this fall semester, so I need to brush up on my Thucydides a little bit. I do teach a lot from him. A magnificent historian, one of the greats, Thucydides, and the Idea of History. I'm really looking forward to this. This might move to near the top of my TBR. And then Richard Ovenden's Burning the Books. This, unfortunately, I think is going to be kind of a timely book. It's a bit of a history about those times during cultural collapses when people start to burn books. It's heartbreaking to think about it. I haven't read this yet, but just kind of flipping through it, he goes all the way back to when the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, and it kind of brings it to the future a little bit. This book was published just last year. I fear it's going to make me angry, maybe a little bit, but I'm looking for some kind of understanding of how this kind of a thing could happen in the Western world, particularly in the United States. We're not exactly at the point of burning books yet, right? But we're not far from it. banning books is just as bad as burning them. And the fact that books are being banned, more books are being banned now in the past couple of years than ever before in American history is shameful. And I don't understand why that is. And it's a sacrilege. It is a true sin. And all of you fellow readers out there, I think you know what I'm talking about. So anyway, that's my TBR, more or less, for the next couple months or weeks. On average, I read about a book a week. But again, that's just on average. I'm never racing to meet a certain goal or a certain number of books. That seems kind of antithetical to the experience of reading. I read at my own pace. Some books I'll take more time with, histories, philosophies. Other books, I've often noticed that modern American fiction, I can read those books rather quickly because of the writing style. American fiction currently is kind of stripped down. Prose is an influence of Ernest Hemingway in many ways, and other writers of the lost generation. That kind of stripped down prose that kind of encourages a quick read. Not to say it's any less insightful than, say, Charles Dickens, but a lot of modern American fiction I read through very quickly. Poetry, I like to linger over. Histories, of course. Also, some things that are not on my TBR, but there are certain authors who are always there. They always show up at some point in the year of every year. I'll be reading this guy over here, Shakespeare. I've read all of Shakespeare's plays many times over. And every year I try to visit at least a couple of those plays. And books about Shakespeare, too, fascinate me. But Shakespeare, if there's ever been a divinely inspired author, it's Shakespeare. Just remarkable, his insight into the human condition. And there's always something new to be discovered by reading and rereading his plays. I just have a great admiration for Shakespeare. Also, some other writers that will, always kind of show up in my reading list as the year progresses. The great classics from Greece and Rome. I mentioned Thucydides and Herodotus and Xenophon, and of course the great philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and then of course the Romans, Livy, Tacitus, Seneca, Sallust, Plutarch. I'm always dipping into those. Oh, and Cicero, one of my favorites. He's been dead for over 2,000 years, but I still think of him as a good friend. So those are the books that show up on my reading list, although they're not technically part of my TBR. Anyway, that's it for now. Keep reading, and I'll talk to you all soon.